don't need to think about it like what we do, but you
Okay.
Okay, I guess we'll call this session to order. Thank you all for your stamina, for hanging on to the very last grand finale panel, 10B. This is a panel all on the 19th century. My name is Cheryl Coulthard. I'm impersonating Jan Bang as the room chair. We have 3 presentations today. Because I took this over last minute, I'm going to ask the presenters to introduce themselves. They'll have 20 minutes each to present, and then once everyone is finished presenting, we'll take questions. So our first speaker today is going to be Mitchell Jones.
Hi, yeah, so my name is Mitchell Jones. I'm at the moment independent historian, but I'll be starting at University of Buffalo next month. I'm from Rochester, New York, which is the birthplace of Mormonism and modern day spiritualism. I'm from the region known as the Finger Lakes. And I'm here today to talk about the Skaneateles community, which existed from 1843 to 1846. It's about 100 kilometers from the city of Skaneateles, north of the Skaneateles Lake, which is one of the Finger Lakes in western New York, in the heart of what's known as the Burnt-Over District, or as John Humphrey Noyes, leader of the Oneida community, described it, the volcanic district of utopian socialism. Next slide, please. So the leader of the Skaneateles community was John Anderson Collins. He was an abolitionist, and he worked for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society alongside figures like William Lloyd Garrison. In July of 1840, well, so he had organized around 100 anti-slavery conventions throughout the Northeast region of the United States. And in July of 1843, Collins was assigned to find Frederick Douglass, self-freed former slave, abolitionist, activist, writer, newspaper publisher, living in Rochester, New York at the time, to find a place to. So Collins was tasked to find a place for him to speak in the Syracuse, New York area. Unfortunately, Collins was unable to find a location for Frederick Douglass, and he ended up speaking at Fayette Park as a last resort. But it ended up being a historic event. Around 500 people eventually gathered. Douglass spoke, and then Collins spoke. And as Collins began to speak, Douglass became increasingly infuriated. He spoke of the narrow-mindedness of abolitionists and spoke instead on socialism, as opposed to wanting to abolish chattel slavery. John Collins believed that all forms of private property were a form of enslavement. So Douglass wrote to Collins's boss at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Maria Weston Chapman, and called for his resignation in late summer of 1843. Next slide, please. Collins had to admit that his heart was no longer in the anti-slavery cause, believing that he had found the solution to all of society's problems, not just the chattel slavery problem. So he began to form the Skaneateles community in the fall of 1843 in Montville, New York, as I said. And he described it as a communist or communitist community. Maria Loomis, the editor of the Communitist newspaper, which was the newspaper printed at the Skaneateles community, described Collins's philosophy this way. Mr. Owen had all property in common. Mr. Collins proposes the same. Thus far, they go hand in hand, but they go no further. Not the least similarity can be discovered between them farther than this. So Collins's form of communism or communitism was Maverick socialism. It was his own formulation. So next slide, please. My article in the Communal Studies journal, the Communal Societies Journal, the Journal of the Communal Studies Association of the United States, argues for a historical materialist explanation of the movement for socialism in general and the Skaneateles community in particular. I argue that the market revolution led by the building of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825, led to a transformation in social and work life, which caused a reaction, and socialism was one of these reactions. Today, though, I want to take a different approach. Next slide, please. Next slide. So again, like I said, I take a more materialist economic approach. The Panic of 1837 was a crisis that caused many to turn to more radicalism. And it also caused a crisis in the abolitionist movement that led to radicalism in the abolitionist movement. Next slide. But today, due to the conference's theme and the fact that we're here at the Rudolf Steiner School, I wanted to take a little bit more of a Steinerite approach rather than a historical materialist approach. So anthroposophy has often been described as a syncretism between science and spirituality. So today I'm going to describe the Skaneateles community as a syncretic communist movement. These two traditions, syncretism and communism, were American traditions, and some of our international friends may, and also American people may be surprised to hear me describe communism as an American tradition, but we'll get into it later. But syncretism was certainly an American tradition having to do with the slave trade. We see evidence of the cosmogram from West Africa in colonial wear in 18th century South Carolina. Also, hoodoo was a religion that actually inspired the Underground Railroad and the spiritualist movement as well, African-American spiritualist movement. Next slide. So here I demonstrate the what's known as the triangular trade here, but this is a triangular cultural trade. So African-American spiritualism and hoodoo and things were inspired by the West African Bakongo priests in Congo and Angola, as well as English Protestantism and Spanish and French Catholicism. Next slide. So syncretism is a mixing, a blending of different ideas. The other American tradition that Collins took advantage of was communism. As I said, for post-Cold War people, it may be strange to hear communism being described as an American tradition, but Lewis Henry Morgan, the anthropologist from Rochester, New York, described the way of life of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois as primitive communism. Today we might, in a more PC way, call it primary communism. And when the Shakers arrived in North America, they really believed that their system was in harmony with the communist system of the Iroquois. When the Shakers had visions in the Gift period in the 1830s, they often spoke with dead Native Americans, Haudenosaunee, as well as Lewis Henry Morgan, and the spirit of Lewis Henry Morgan. So the Shakers were a clear link between Christianity, spiritualism, indigenous religion, and the American tradition of communism. Next slide, please. So the region that I'm from and the region that Collins chose to set up his community was known as the Burnt Over District. Collins moved from Massachusetts, he moved to Massachusetts in 1830 to attend Andover Theological Seminary, as many radicals at the time did. However, he eventually turned away from religion. But the Western New York was known as the burnt over district because of the Second Great Awakening movement led by itinerant minister Charles Finney from roughly 1825 to 1835. And the two theological contributions of the Second Great Awakening to American communism were perfectionism and millenarianism. Perfectionism being the idea that sin can be eliminated, or that perfection can be achieved here on earth, not in heaven, through elimination of sin. And then millenarianism, the belief that Jesus Christ will come back to the earth and reign for 1,000 years. Next slide, please. So here we see there's the burnt over district there in New York State. Which, as I mentioned earlier, John Humphrey Noyes of the Oneida community called the volcanic district of Fourierism. All right, next slide. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but there have already been talks at this conference on some of the transatlantic religious communists who came from Europe early on. Many of them in the mid to late 18th century, and formed a basis for the communist tradition in the United States. Next slide. So here I just graphically illustrated the transatlantic movement of these religious communists. Okay, next slide, please. But as I said, John Collins was not a religious communist. In fact, he eschewed religion. And in 1842, he was one of the founders of the Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform, which was what was called a free thinkers society. Free thinkers were people that questioned orthodox religious doctrine. Many of them were religious themselves, but others were what were known as infidels, who didn't believe in God at all. Collins was among those that was one of the infidels. In his statement of articles of belief and disbelief and creed, that was published in the November 19th, 1843 Onondaga Standard newspaper, he said, the creed on which they stood was a disbelief in any special revelation of God to man, touching his will, and therefore binding upon men as authority in any arbitrary sense, that all forms of worship should cease, that all religions of every age and nation have their origin in the same falsehood vis-a-vis God's special providences. So Collins believed in the truth of Jesus' teachings, but he did not believe in their divine inspiration. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, Collins was inspired by Robert Owen, and Owen, like Collins, opposed private property. He was also an infidel, and a lot of the early news about the Owenite movement focused on his infidel beliefs rather than his communist beliefs. So Owen spoke before the United States Congress in 1824, saying the national mind must reject economic tyranny and embrace harmonious brotherhood. And so he formed the New Harmony community, which he bought from the religious communists, the Rappites, in the 1820s. Next slide. So here I demonstrate Robert Owen started in a textile mill in New Lanark, Scotland, and came to and founded New Harmony in Indiana, USA in 1825. Next slide. Another big influence on Collins was, of course, William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the founders of the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. As I mentioned earlier, the Panic of 1837 was an economic depression, which also caused a corresponding panic in the abolitionist movement. Arthur Tappan was a textile manufacturer that was a big patron of Garrison and the Liberator newspaper and the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And he experienced a real crash in his finances in 1837 and was no longer able to really support the anti-slavery movement as much as he did. And he led a walkout of people that were opposed to conservative abolitionists, that were opposed to women taking leadership roles in 1837. So loosed from Arthur Tappan's patronage, William Lloyd Garrison began to develop the concepts of no government and non-resistance. The belief was that government authority was not the answer, nor was violence. Collins agreed with this, and in June of 1844, he wrote, "Force begets force. There may be power in a bullet, but neither argument nor love follows its force. Touch not these governments, they oppress. They have their origin in oppression. Let the rich who need their protections do all the work and pay all the taxes. Touch not a ballot, it is a sheath stored. Attend no election, they are powder magazines." So the idea of no government, non-resistance was not to reject all institutions, but to build alternative institutions that were in line with God's plan. Next slide, please. So here we have, I'm just demonstrating Garrison's influence on Collins. Okay, next slide. Another Owenite that really influenced Collins was Fanny Wright and her Nashoba colony in Tennessee, which was the first to connect Owenite communism with abolitionism. It was founded in 1825 to purchase slaves at auction and attempted to educate them in self-reliance and communal living to prepare them for life as free people. But it failed by the end of the 1820s, and the abolitionist project did not really work out. Next slide. So like Owen, Fanny Wright was the daughter of a linen manufacturer and came from Scotland in 1818 and founded Nashoba in 1825. Next slide. Another influence was Charles Fourier. As I said, Western New York was the volcanic district of Fourierism. The Skaneateles community was founded during the peak of Fourierism in the volcanic district. And the Fourier Society of the City of Rochester was founded in 1843. Albert Brisbane, the prophet of Fourierism to the United States, was born in Batavia, New York, which is in this region. And Collins critiqued Fourierism, but he saw them as fellow travelers. He said Fourierism was a good school for communism, but disagreed with their individualistic ideas about passional attraction. Next slide. So we have Fourier from France influencing Albert Brisbane, who influenced the Fourierist movement in Western New York. Next slide. Another person who was involved in the Skaneateles community early on was Ernestine Rose. Ernestine Rose was born in Poland in 1810, the daughter of a rabbi. She traveled to the United States in May 1836 after meeting Robert Owen in England. She had lectured on slavery, religion, and women's rights. And she and her husband intended to move to the Skaneateles community. And she spoke at the founding convention in 1823. However, she disagreed with them over the issue of a deed. Rose believed they should have a deed. Collins was opposed. And there ultimately was a compromise over the deed. They put everybody in the community in the deed. Which led to loopholes for lawyers and others to make off with a lot of the community's property, which set them back. So next slide. So there's Rose coming from Poland in 1843 or 1836, and her association with the Skaneateles community. Next slide. I won't talk extensively on this, but this was another sort of pseudo-Fourierist institution, Northampton Association for Education and Industry in Massachusetts. It was founded by silk manufacturers who were victims of the Panic of 1837. And significantly, the abolitionist Sojourner Truth and David Riggles lived at that community. Next slide. So there we have Northampton in Massachusetts influencing Collins in New York. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, ultimately they did lose a great deal of their land due to the loopholes in the deed. In 1845, they attempted to incorporate as a corporation so they could do business in New York State, but the New York State legislature refused. And after that, they only lasted another 9 months into 1846. The utopian chronicler A.J. MacDonald said the experiment did not fail through pecuniary embarrassment. The property was worth twice as much when the community dissolved as it was at first, and was much more than sufficient to pay all debts. The Skaneateles community member Sam Sellers wrote to Mary Weston Chapman again in 1846 to try and get Collins his job as an anti-slavery agent back without Collins's knowledge, actually. And he said to Mary Weston Chapman, the community enterprise he has got through with and has abandoned. Principle and practice. He is out of money, out of excuse, out of business, out of credit, to some extent out of spirit and out of breath, out of elbows, out and quite roughly everything but of difficulties. So Collins moved west to California and became a self-concerned businessman. However, he supported the Republican Party in 1856 in the lead up to the Civil War. Next slide. And there's just a few more pictures of the grounds. Some of them are from Arthur Bester's research in the 1940s. And then some of them are my own pictures of the site today. Thanks very much.
The question is, what people think about it? Say, well, what are their border long-term impacts? For example, the Italy history, which we see at the time of 47 population, the impact of different politics, different culture, different economy, different heritage, even though the people is not falling apart, but taking the rest. So, was this just a relation to their history, or did they have at least professional? Did it have long-lasting impact on the manufacturing?
I'm just going to repeat this question for the Zoom audience. So Aharon was asking if the 19th century communities were just kind of a blip in the American history, or whether they had a long-term impact.
Yeah, they were absolutely short-lived. Most of them, you know, a lot of them around 3 years, you know, or maybe 4 max. As far as, you know, long-ranging impact, well, a lot of them left a sour taste in people's mouth for socialism, and so there was a reaction to that. But also, a lot of the Fourier's, Horace Greeley in particular, became leaders in the Republican Party once the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s. And then many of them also joined in the Union Army during the Civil War, and later became, you know, radical Republicans advocating Reconstruction in the South to transition away from slavery. Unfortunately, that didn't last long either, and the Compromise of 1877 basically ended that project. But the shift, as I see it, was away from an idea of harmony between classes and moral suasion as a technique to class struggle and violence as the technique. And so I think there was a real shift there after the failure of these communities in the 1850s. And then that led up to the Civil War.
Because they failed, people will resort to violence, or another way around?
Yeah, so because they failed, there was a rejection of socialism broadly, and a lot of the Fourierists and a lot of these other, what you might call utopian socialists, believe that the bosses and the workers should get along together. And so the socialists that came after, many of them actually coming from Germany as a result of the revolutions of 1848 against the Prussian Empire. Many of them were Marxist. And so instead of this idea of harmony between capital and labor, they believed in class struggle. And then the moral suasion idea, as it became more and more clear that slave owners weren't going to voluntarily give up their slaves, the abolitionists moved from this idea that you can influence people by appealing to their religion and appealing to their morality, to an idea of that state violence was necessary.
But it proved that this path doesn't work. That's possible.
Yeah, in a way, I would say, and there was, like the Mormons, they started in Western New York, and then they were thrown out of Western New York because of their strange ideas, and then when the Oneida community formed, the leader of the Oneida community also fled from New York in that region. And many of the Fourierists said there was a sour taste left in people's mouth about that. But a lot of those people actually moved out west, and sort of following the Mormon example. And actually, Horace Greeley was the one who said, "Go west, young man."
Damian also wants to respond.
Okay. Yeah.
We had a question.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. My question relates to the division of labor and compensation around women's labor, men's labor, and who benefited from the community's freedoms. In what sense were women in these communities economically empowered in any way, especially married women, since at the time the property and rights of women were barely above, they were very encumbered. And of course, yeah. And I say this as someone who looked at the current crop in the FIC directory, and one conclusion I said is, well, we seem to have worked out the equality among men and women in terms of division of leadership and participation. So, but, I was talking on a very superficial level. So I'd be interested in your dystopia, in your economic analysis, and in these communities you studied. To what extent were women economically equal, especially married women?
So I mentioned Ernestine Rose, as well as briefly mentioned Maria Loomis, but Maria Loomis was the editor of the Communitist magazine for several years, and had a leadership position in the community. But Ernestine Rose, one of the reasons she ultimately decided not to join the community is that she visited it like a year or so later and said most of the women were doing all the domestic work, doing double shifts, so to speak, despite the fact that Collins, the year prior, had written an editorial arguing that men should do the domestic work. So there was, and also in terms of voting, in terms of work, in terms of compensation, if they were to leave, women were absolutely seen as equal. Unfortunately, however, in practice, it maybe didn't always work out that way, and that was part of Ernestine Rose's critique.
And I think it also was a class-inflected issue, that what women, should have divided work with men, etc., etc. That was possible in a middle class, environment. I mean, let's so say, in my case, where the men work 16 hours, and under the most, the parts of the factory were called the slaughterhouse, where the crane operators, kind of, higher stratum of labor, were playing games like dropping heavy metal on unskilled labor. Okay.
The would be more the utopian response to dystopian reality.
Yeah, I mean back to and let me answer her question. Okay, in a sentence. So the victory. I mean the victory was meant for a few years at least. That workers had a say in wages, hours. Okay. The length of the work day, and certain safety measures. But when Trautmann goes back to the same factory in 1913, most of these things, have been, And so, but the Soviet, at least as a transitional mode, called for precisely these things, rather than workers' management of production. So even, Lenin in 1917 is, we don't want that, because you and I don't know anything about the factory, so we have to keep those bourgeois managers, in place to survive. And this led to many conflicts.
Just in the phalanx study, this is very different from the Northampton Association, the Wisconsin phalanx, the North American phalanx. We were studied by Amy Hart. There's all the women were excluded from the economic and political decision, and there was a discrimination about the wages. They paid about half of the wages of the men. The situation. So, but this question was addressed in the book by Amy. So, in the Algerian movement, there was a change during the time period, especially when there were new members coming from the Commune de Paris in the 80s, 70s, with more libertarian mind and liberal mind, and that was the beginning of a conflict in the community, and the young community, the young people create a new community in which women and men were equal, but it forced also the old community to change the political right and the business right for women. So at the end, there was maybe the book from Diana Garneau about Citoyenne and Icaria, and she wrote a lot about this, about how the women take power also in the old Icarian society. So it's very interesting for that.
Yeah, I want to mention too, the burnt over district of the Second Great Awakening became the hotbed of suffragist activity. And one of the reasons for that was that during the Second Great Awakening, women were able to be leaders in the church. They couldn't be priests necessarily, but they could be prayer leaders and choir leaders and things like that. And a lot of in Rochester, I study the Fourierist movement in Rochester too, and a lot of the leaders of the Fourierist movement in Rochester, such as Sarah Fish and her daughter Catherine Stebbins Fish, and then and Huldah Anthony, they were at the Seneca Falls Convention and big activists in the suffrage movement as well, and friends with Amy Post, who was a famous abolitionist and suffragist from Rochester too. And Huldah Anthony was a relative. She was like a great aunt or something of Susan B. Anthony. So they were actually related by blood.
Any more questions from the Zoom audience? Nothing? Any more questions in the room? All right, then let's thank our speakers and our tech team. And thank you for the audience for having the stamina to carry through to this last session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for, doing the moderating,